lunch for a bunch of conservatives. So I thought, since I talked to a group of people at Turning Point in Dallas, I think it was in Dallas, about 6 months ago, 5 months ago, something like that. And I've gone to a lot of different places since then, about 50 cities, I think, maybe more. And I thought I would tell you about some of the things that I've been formulating more precisely, let's say, over that 6-month period. I think it's particularly relevant to an audience that leans to the conservative side of the spectrum. I've talked to Canadian politicians about this too, because one of the things I've come to realize over the last few years is that, and this is why you're all here actually, so many young people here, is that for the first time in my memory, conservatives actually have something to sell young people. And that really is quite shocking, because it's generally the case that as people age, they get more conservative. And the conservatives have had a difficult time promoting their doctrine, let's say, among people who are young. As young people tend to be rebellious, and there's some utility in that. And they also tend to be fed up to some degree with having the finger of duty shaken at them, let's say, and to be subjected constantly to messages that are associated with how you should behave. And fair enough, because there's some utility in youthful rebelliousness, and there's some necessary critical intelligence that drives young people's skepticism about their elders informing them about how they should behave. Maybe a certain nose for hypocrisy, for example. I mean, you don't want to push that too far, because people are bound to be somewhat hypocritical, because none of us are perfect. And the fact that those who are older than you aren't perfect in what they do doesn't justify your nihilistic and self-destructive cynicism. It's not a helpful response. But pure adherence to a message of duty that's unthinking is also not helpful. So here's the way that I've been laying out the argument. And so the first thing, it's an argument about hierarchies, essentially. And it's incidentally an argument about values, because there actually isn't a difference between a hierarchy. There is no difference between hierarchy and values. And the reason for that is that to value one thing is to put it ahead of something else, right? That's what it means to value something. And so if you're considering a variety of different options for your life, or options for how you might conduct your life, and every single thing you consider is equal, then you have no value structure, and then you have no direction. And so that's not helpful. So, and one of the things that deeply disturbs me about what's happening on the radical end of the leftist intellectual spectrum is that there's no true psychological understanding of the fundamental utility and necessity of hierarchies. So what I'm going to do today, for the amount of time that I'm going to talk and not take questions, is to talk about the fundamental necessity of hierarchies. See, if you're conservative by temperamental orientation, you have a proclivity to be comfortable within, and also to want to defend hierarchies. And that can become a real problem, because hierarchies can become corrupt and blind and immobile and rigid. It happens all the time. It's often why businesses fail. It's also why we throw governments out on a fairly regular basis, right? Is to mitigate against that stultification and corruption. But the mere fact that something can become dysfunctional doesn't mean that it's dysfunctional in and of itself. It just means that there's a danger. Okay, so here's the argument. So the first thing that we might want to establish is that there are important problems that need to be solved. I think everyone would agree with that. And what's the evidence for that? Well, the fundamental evidence that there's important problems that need to be solved is that people are suffering, people are hurt, that life isn't everything it could be, that there's no shortage of malevolence in the world and privation, and that not just on a global or social scale, but in our individual lives, right? There's illnesses that need to be defeated. You know, I was talking to this Danish economist, political scientist a few days ago named Bjorn Lomborg, who I would very much recommend, by the way, because I think Bjorn's a very smart person. And he said, it's within our power to eradicate tuberculosis in the next 15 years. We could just get rid of it worldwide. That seems like it would be a good thing to do, right? I think we could agree that there are important problems that need to be solved. And I think the reason we agree about that, regardless of who we are, is that we see the suffering that those problems cause, and would generally presume that the less of that, the better, especially if it was avoidable. All right, so then we can agree on that. The next thing we might agree on is, well, some people are better at solving problems than others. And it isn't always the same people. It depends on the problem, you know. If the problem is how you're going to throw a basketball through a hoop, then you're going to get a subset of people who are spectacularly good at that. But if your problem is how to formulate social policy to eradicate tuberculosis worldwide, you're going to get a different group of people who are particularly good at that. It doesn't matter. The point is that as soon as you identify a problem and then you decide that it's necessary to solve it, then you're going to find that there's some people who are way better at solving it than other people. And maybe they have the requisite knowledge, or they have the requisite discipline, or maybe they're just older, and so they have more experience and better connection networks. It doesn't matter. But if it's an important problem, and there's a small number of people who are better at solving it, which is, I think, an undeniable truth, then the next logical thing to do is to put the people who know how to solve the problems in charge of solving the problems. Right? I don't see a way out of that. If you're willing to assume that the problem needs to be solved, once you've bought into that, well, then you've also bought into, and if you accept the proposition that some people are better at it than others, and I just can't see how you can have any sense at all and not accept that proposition, because if you reject that proposition, you reject the idea that there is valid knowledge per se. And if you're going to reject that, well, then there's just no point talking to you, right? Because you're out of the domain where knowledge is even something that can be discussed. You're not going anywhere with that. You just walk away from an argument if it gets to that point, because it's so completely foolish. All right, so what's next? Well, the next is, if you're going to solve important problems, it's highly probable that you're going to do it with other people. You're going to do it while you're competing and cooperating with other people. And so that means that if you put the people who can solve the problem in charge, and then you implement your solution socially, then you're going to produce a hierarchy. And you're going to produce a hierarchy with those who can at the top and those who can't at the bottom. Now, maybe the hierarchy is set up extraordinarily intelligently so that the people who are at the top are doing everything they can to solve the problem, including training the people at different strata in the hierarchy beneath them, so that they can get better and better at solving the problem, and hopefully can advance up the hierarchy as the whole process moves ahead. Right? So that would be an optimal hierarchy, because it's permeable for those who have ability. And so, and that's it's a really important concept. I mean, I think it's one of the concepts that's at the core of the popular idea of the American dream. The idea is that, well, it doesn't matter what your hierarchical position is to begin with. If you have the ability and the willingness to put that ability into practice, then the hierarchy should be permeable enough so that you can rise to the top. Partly because, well, that's going to be motivating to you, because then you get to benefit from the fruits of your labor, but also it's really useful for all the rest of us who are exceptionally selfish, because if we're smart and we organize our hierarchies properly, and we get the people who can to do, then we get to benefit from everything that they manage to do. And that seems useful, because there aren't that many people that can design computer chips. There's maybe a handful of them in the world, and the fact that they get to go design computer chips means that we all get to have cell phones, and maybe that's the world's worst curse. It's certainly a possibility, but it's something that we are definitely interested in. And so it's pretty obvious that having those that can do and not putting barriers in the way to their success, if we have serious problems, is absolutely vital. So, and that's another reason I think it's also a reason why it's perfectly appropriate to be concerned about equality of opportunity. And I think that's something that conservatives actually have to be somewhat careful about, because they tend to support hierarchies. Their typical political error is to produce structures where the permeability of movement within has been compromised to some degree. And so that could be a problem, so that's something to keep in mind, right? You don't want the structure that you build to solve problems to be dominated by people who are merely taking advantage of their position within the hierarchy. Now, the leftist criticism of the West, that it's an oppressive patriarchy, which is such a... well, it's partly an oppressive patriarchy some of the time, but not so much when compared to every other structure that's ever been built by human beings. Right? That's a much better way of putting it. It's much different. Well, the thing is, you also give the devil his due to some degree, because it's not like there isn't plenty of malevolent bloodshed in our history. There's plenty, right? The world's a rough place. And you know, when I look at the West, I think, well, the world is a rough place, and it's rough everywhere, but at least we managed to accomplish something along with all the roughness. And that's something, you know? It's something to be maybe not proud of, but at least to be bloody aware of and to be grateful for. That might be better. The modicum of freedom that we do have and the security that we do have and all of that, the opportunities that are ahead of us, the long lifespan that we have, that was paid for at tremendous cost. There's no doubt about it. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and a little gratitude is a useful thing. Okay, so now you have a hierarchy and the people who can run the hierarchy. And then the question is, well, what's the utility of a hierarchy? Well, one of them is that you can solve problems, and it's important to solve problems. But another is that, you see, and this is where the conservatives have something to say to young people. You know, often when people conceptualize marriage, I've watched this through my whole life, you know, because, well, I was born in 1962, and I can remember the 60s to some degree. I can really remember the 70s, and I can remember the general attitude that was pervasive among young people, and certainly the case now, with regards to marriage, for example, and that it was always regarded as, in some sense, on the more cynical end, as a sort of an imposition and constraint on freedom. Right? And the problem with that is that it's also an aspiration. You see, and that's the thing that I think we lost in our culture over the last 50 years. We've lost the idea that the responsibility that's associated with proper behavior within a structured hierarchy of values is also an aspiration. You know, you could say, well, you should get married. It's the right thing to do. It's like, fine. That's a commandment. But it's not the most fundamental argument. It's like there's a limited number of things that you're going to be able to do with your life that are truly of value. Right? You're going to be of some service to yourself with any luck. You'll at least be able to take care of yourself if you're fortunate and willing. It's just sort of like that sort of minimum necessary requirement for being an admirable human being and a citizen. And I'm not talking about people who are too ill to take care of themselves. That's a whole different issue. And then maybe you could be of some utility to your family. That might not be a bad second move, you know? And then if you've got a little bit left over, well, maybe you could be of some broader utility to your society if you have enough ability to do that. And that's all should. But the other thing is that's where you're going to derive all the meaning from your life. You know, like, I've been married 30 years coming next year, you know, and you know, and it's not exactly something that happens to you. It's something that you accomplish. And I mean, I'm not trying to take undue credit for that. Like, I'm not saying that the fact that I've been married for 30 years is like a spectacular accomplishment on my part and that there's something unique about that. That's not my point. My point is that part of the reason that's valuable is because it's an aspirational goal. Like, it's something to manage, man. You think, you take a vow, you take a marital vow, and you say, well, I'm going to forsake all other people, and I'm going to stand by you in sickness or in health. Like, that's no trivial vow, man. That's a hell of a sacrifice. It's nobody else, and there's a lot of other people. And if it's in sickness and in health, you can bloody well be sure that there's going to be times where the sickness and the destabilization is so intense that it's virtually unbearable. That's definitely coming down the pipeway for you. There's no doubt about it. And then you can endure through that, and you can build something of value, right? That makes you more than someone that's chasing a brief whim. It's something you build over decades. And it makes you stronger and better doing that. Because to negotiate with another person over that period of time, to do that successfully, means that you're going to have to get a lot less stupid than you currently are. And hopefully the same applies to them because of the constant tension and the communication, right? You really have to take someone else seriously into account. And then that makes you a much more complicated creature than you would otherwise be. And that's not living happily ever after. That's mutually building one another into people with better characters. And that's way better. And then maybe you could also manage to set up a circumstance where you have enough stability between you and enough vision as a consequence of that, and enough good sense so that you can bring children into the world, and they have the security that's necessary to stop them from being anxious and depressed and nihilistic and hopeless, and so that they exist within a structure that gives them some optimism about what it means to be a responsible adult, and so that they can observe at the same time that two people can clash intensely during periods of extreme duress, right, and work out a solution and still not only stay together, but maybe even fortify their bonds, right? It gives you some sense about the potential value of the word that a human being might offer. I mean, one of the things we do in our society that's extraordinarily foolish is that we dispute the authority that children have over, or that adults have over children. We question why that should be the case. And there's a real simple answer to it. It's like, well, why should children respect adults, given how much adult behavior is not worthy of respect? Well, that's a perfectly reasonable question, but the fundamental answer is something like, well, how long are you going to be a child? It's like 18 years. How long are you going to be an adult? Well, let's say 70 years or 60 years. Well, if there's nothing respectable about being an adult, nothing worthwhile about taking on the mature responsibility that would be associated with adulthood, then why the hell would you ever grow up? What good is the rest of your life if you already accomplished everything that you could have accomplished in the magic of childhood? And the magic of childhood is a lot more magical when you look at it backwards, delusional 30 years later, and you forget what it was actually like to be a child. It's much better to grow up. It's much better to take some responsibility. Part of the reason for that is that the responsibility, this is the crucial issue. This is the crucial issue. And this is what the conservatives have to sell. The meaning that you need to withstand the catastrophe of your life is to be found in the voluntary adoption of responsibility. It's as simple as that. We haven't formulated this proposition properly, because the people on the left, they object to the imposition of that responsibility, and the people on the right tend to construe it as duty. And there's nothing wrong with construing it as duty. I think you have a duty, but that's not the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is, what are you going to do with your miserable life to justify it? Because you have to wake up at 3 in the morning when things aren't so good for you. And maybe things are falling apart for you. Maybe because of things that you've done. Or maybe because you're just somewhat hopeless about, your existential position in the world. And there's going to be plenty of times when you have reason for that. And I know perfectly well that the things that you're going to be able to point to allow you to have a modicum of self-respect are the things that you've managed to accomplish as a consequence of adopting the difficult responsibilities of maturity. You'll be able to say, well, despite my flaws, manifest as they are, here's the things I've managed. And there aren't that many things to manage. That's the other thing. You don't want to destroy too much, because, what do you have in your life? Well, you've got an intimate relationship, right? If you're fortunate. That's what you're going to have a sequence of meaningless intimate relationships that are short-term. And there isn't any evidence that that's good for people. as far as I can tell. It's good to have an intimate relationship that's lasting. It gives your life some solidity, right? And it's what people generally want, but it's effort, it's work, it's negotiation, and more importantly, it's an accomplishment. You know, it's something to aim at, and you think, well, you need something to aim at because the aims that we have give meaning to our life. This is even true technically. See, because almost all of the positive emotion that people experience is experienced not as a consequence of accomplishing something, but as a consequence of watching themselves move towards something of value, right? Because we're creatures of pursuit. We want to be moving towards a better place, and in order, and if we can see ourselves moving towards a better place, then we feel that our life has meaning. We feel invigorated and hopeful, right? It's analgesic. It keeps anxiety under control. But in order for that to happen, we have to have aims. And the right aims are the responsible aims. It's like have an intimate relationship. See if you can manage it. Not be sort of useless about it, and so changeable, and so characterized or obsessed by the pursuit of short-term gratification, and so willing to leap out of the boat as soon as the seas become too stormy. It's like you're in stormy seas anyways, and whatever you leap out into isn't going to be any better than what you already had in all likelihood. But it's the aspirational element of that. It's like, well, and maybe you could have a family, you could have some kids. Well, what else are you going to do with your life? What do you plan to do when you're 40 and older? You don't have any children. That's not a smart move. So maybe you have some children, and you know, this is a lie that we tell young women all the time. The most important thing in your life is going to be your career. It's such bloody rubbish. It's just not true. You know, here's why. First of all, most people don't have careers. They have jobs. And that's not the same thing. And second, even among the people who do have careers, a small minority of people have like exceptionally productive and engaging careers. That's very rough. You have to be fortunate, and you have to be fortunate, able, and insanely dedicated to have that kind of career. And you have to make sacrifices to have it. And one of the things you may well sacrifice is your family. And it's not obvious that that's an intelligent sacrifice, even though it's necessary for some people to make it. Most people, they're going to find the broad-scale population surveys show this quite clearly. 75% of Americans agree that the most meaningful elements of their life are to be found in their familial relationships. It's like, and so the idea that career is going to be it's like, what career could possibly justify that sacrifice? Like, I've had a great career, and I'll tell you, man, as I get older, my family is more and more important than my career. Right? And it's not because there's something peculiar about me. That's just how it is. So you can have an intimate relationship, and maybe you can manage to make that a mutual, protracted benefit, to give your life some solidity, right? To have something that you can grip onto and build across time, and then you can put forward a structure within which you could bring children into the world in the most beneficial possible manner. That's an aspiration. Are you up for it or not? You know, think, well, the alternative is that rebellious, impulsive gratification. It's like the evidence is quite clear that people in committed monogamous relationships are more satisfied sexually than those who are not. So it doesn't even work on its own principles. Here's another thing that's interesting. Let's say I've thought about this idea of living together before you get married. It's like, okay, what does that mean exactly if you're going to live with someone before you marry them? It's like, well, it means something like this. You'll do for now, but if someone else comes along, I reserve the right to trade you in. I'll grant you the same right, because it's obvious to both of us that neither of us are good enough at the current time to justify the sacrifice that would entail marriage. It's not that romantic an offer. You'll do for now. You know, and the idea is, well, we'll try each other out. It's like, oh, is that right? That's how it works. You're going to try each other out. How are you going to do that without commitment? How in the world do you think you're going to get to know someone in the absence of a serious commitment? Why in the world would you think they would let you get to know them if they knew you could run away screaming as soon as they got to the bottom of your heart? It's just facade. And what happens is that common law couples are much more likely to separate, and people who live together before marriage are much more likely to get divorced. So not only can it not work conceptually, it just doesn't work. So, and it's because I think many times when you're trying to establish something of a certain profundity, you have to make the sacrifice up front, right? You have to throw yourself all in, or you don't get it. And I think most things are like that. Okay, so there's a family, and there's a marriage, and there's children, and there's friends, you need friends, and you have to develop a career and be of some, so that you can keep body and soul together and be of some utility to your community, and to have some regularity and ritual in your life, some routine, because very few people can survive without being of use to other people, and even a smaller fraction can survive without some routine. And so that's like 5 things. There's more, but that's it. And those are all aspirations. Could you, even if what you have is a job and not a career, could you do your job properly? Like, the jobs are important. You could do them properly, and then it would be done well, and then there'd be a little nexus around you because you did it well that would improve. It's not trivial, right? And you could have your marriage and make it work, and you could have your children and take care of them properly, and then you'd have a life, right? And maybe you wouldn't be nihilistic and wondering what the meaning was. Because my sense is the reason that people wonder about whether or not their life has enough meaning is fundamentally because they don't take enough responsibility. You take enough responsibility, you won't have that question. Because you'll be thinking, yeah, I'm getting up this morning because there's important things to do. And they're self-evidently important. And so if that nihilism visits you, well, and this is part of the problem with what's happening, I think, more broadly speaking, in our educational system. It's based on a misapprehension of the realities of human psychology. It's like, of course hierarchies can become corrupt, obviously, but without them, the value structure collapses, and then people have nothing. They have no aim. Well, they have no aim. They're anxious because they could be going in any direction. Well, that's not freedom. That's just chaos. And there's nothing valuable to strive for, right? In this aspirational sense. What do you want to strive for? Something difficult. It justifies your existence. And I'll close with this. Existential psychotherapists in the 1950s, critics of Freud. Freud believed that if you were, I'm simplifying Freud, and in a somewhat unfair manner, but I have to do that for the purposes of this argument, fundamentally. It's not completely unfair. Freud basically believed that if you weren't psychologically healthy as an adult, it was because something bad had happened to you when you were young. You'd undergone some sort of traumatic experience. But the existentialists came along in the 1950s and they said, look, no, fair enough, terrible things can happen to you when you're young and they can hurt you, but life itself is a traumatic catastrophe. Right? Because you're plagued by serious problems. It's built into the structure of existence itself. That's the suffering that's built into the structure of existence itself. And the proclivity for people to be malevolent and for them to wreak havoc on the world. It's an eternal truth. Both of those, eternal truths. You're stuck with it. The question is, and if that's all you have, then you can't tolerate your own existence. It makes you desperate and unhappy and anxious and bitter and cynical and vengeful and cruel and destructive. That's the pathway, because you can't handle that kind of weight with no counterposition. And so the question is, well, what do you have as a counterposition? And it's not happiness. It can't be, because happiness disappears in the face of suffering. Well, what can it be? It can be the willingness to take on the load of dealing with that situation, right? There's suffering in the world that needs to be ameliorated. There's malevolence that needs to be constrained, not least in your own heart. The way you deal with that is by taking responsibility. And the responsibility gives your life meaning. And the more responsibility, this is the thing that's so interesting about this, is the more responsibility that you decide to take on, the more meaningful your life becomes. Well, maybe that's what you want, and maybe that's what you have to sell to young people. I think it is exactly the case, and I think that they're starving for that. And it's not just young people, all these people that I've been talking to around the world, they're literally dying for not knowing this. Because people come to me all the time after my talks and say, look, I was suicidal 6 months ago, or I had a terrible alcohol problem, or I was addicted, or I was in some local form of hell, that's associated with pointlessness and suffering. And I decided that I was going to be more careful with what I said and to take more responsibility, to try to put my life together, and it's working. And that's the thing, is that it works. And how could it not work? The world is full of problems that need to be addressed, right? And they're serious. And you could address them. And if you address them, that would make something of you. And then you can take that thing that's made of you, you know, that you can rely on, and you can put that against the catastrophe. And you can say, the potential that I have to bring to bear on the suffering and catastrophe of the world supersedes the catastrophe and the suffering. There's more to me than there is to the problems. You know, and maybe that's not true, but maybe it is. You could see in your life if it was true. It might be true for you. You know, we already know that for you just to stand up and take the responsibility to face the catastrophe right away, that's psychologically beneficial. And then, so not only is it psychologically beneficial, it does turn out that we actually can solve problems. So it's psychologically beneficial and practically beneficial. And I think we're at a crossroads in some sense in our society, in our world. We're becoming so powerful technologically. There's almost nothing that's not within the realm of possibility, right? And if we got ourselves together one by one, because I think that's the right way to do it, man, there's no limit to what we could accomplish. And so there's no limit to what you could accomplish. It's like, great! There's an endless array of catastrophic problems, and they're enough to take you out, allied with the fact that there's no limit to what you can do with truth and responsibility. And so that's as optimistic as it gets. And I don't think there's anything truer that can be said than that. So thank you very much.